Well, good evening. This is week 3 of EDLS 550. This is Dr. Stockdale, and today I'd like to talk to you about building connections between school and home. Part of your task in this course is getting to know a particular child in your classroom, and part of that means getting to know his or her family and the community from which they come. So I hope to offer you some ways to help create a more welcoming and responsive climate in your classroom and in your school. Hopefully, some of the ideas that I share with you, you'll be able to share with others at your school. We're going to talk about some commonly held misconceptions about diverse families, and I'm going to suggest a few practical ideas that you might be able to use to connect with your students' families and help meet their needs. But first, I thought that we would start thinking about our own families. And so, for just a moment in your head, if you'll, or either on your phone, you know, pull a recent picture up of maybe a celebration where you had your immediate family or your extended family in a photo, and think about the relationships within that photo. So here's a photo I think I've already shared with you all of my family at Christmas. Somehow through the years I've become the matriarch, and Christmas is always held at my house. And one of our family traditions is posing in front of the Christmas tree. And we always have a good time doing this because after we take our regular photo, then we pose for our silly photo. And it's been fun to watch through the years how these photos have changed. And so when I look at my family and I think of all the joy and the laughter and the funny stories that we can tell about our gatherings, if I'm honest with myself, I also have to see the things that aren't so pretty. You know, in this photo, I see 2 divorces. I see the death of a spouse and the grieving that this family has had to go through. I see remarriage. I see a blended family. I even see some run-ins with the law and some issues with drug and alcohol abuse as teenagers. And what I see here is an imperfect family. Because let's face it, none of us are perfect, and none of us have perfect families. So we need to keep that in mind as we're learning about our students' families. And hey, we're all a little bit crazy in our own way, right? So I liked this quote that no family is perfect. We argue, we fight, we even stop talking to each other at times, but in the end, family is family. The love will always be there. So as you are thinking about your students and getting to know them, I wanted to remind you to be careful not to make assumptions. And I'm using a picture of my own great nephew to bring this point to light. So if you look at little Noah here with his blonde hair and blue eyes, you would probably think of his, I don't know, maybe English background, or if I were to check his DNA, he might even be, I don't know, maybe a little bit Swedish, Norwegian. But in reality, these are his parents. My niece is on the right, and her husband, Victor, is a first-generation immigrant. His parents are from Mexico. Victor is completely bilingual in listening, speaking, reading, and writing in English and Spanish, although they have chosen, sadly, not to pass on any of that language to their children. They actually have 3 children, and little Noah is this couple's biological child. His grandmother, my brother's wife, is blonde-haired, blue-eyed, and it looks like his genes skipped a generation. So this blonde-haired, blue-eyed child is actually Hispanic, although his parents have chosen to label in Power School, he's labeled as white, but he could just as easily have claimed, or they could have claimed, that Hispanic heritage for him. So just be thinking about, even though a child may look a certain way in your class, you don't want to make any assumptions about his or her family. And in order for us to grow in our own understandings of diversity, we really need to look on our own personal backgrounds, because oftentimes how we were raised is what we think is best, when in fact there are a lot of different right ways to do things. So I want you to think about your family traditions, holidays, vacations, and special events as you were growing up. And take a few moments, if you will, to look at this graphic organizer that I've created. And I often use this with my students, and we don't do all of this in one day, but throughout, over the course of some time, I ask them to reflect on, what are your mealtime and routines? What are some of your favorite foods? How does your family spend holidays and special events? What are some special events in your family? Can you tell me a little bit about your bedtime or bath time routines? Do you have to ever take a nap? Tell me about some of your vacations and family trips. You might want to ask yourself and your students about the games they play and the way in which they play. Who do they play with when they're at home? Think about who you played with as a child. And then the rules and discipline. What kinds of rules do you have in your house? Thinking back on your own rules. Maybe were they similar, or are they different from your child that you're studying? So just some things that you might want to include when you introduce me to your child when you're writing that final paper, as you're researching. So think about these areas. Knowing that our sociocultural consciousness is that our worldview is not universal, that each individual is profoundly influenced by his or her own life experiences. We're influenced by a variety of factors, not just our race, ethnicity, gender, and social class, but that is certainly part of it. And we need to avoid using our own personal experiences to make sense of our students' lives. Looking at home and the influences of home and the environment in which the child is growing and developing. And it's not just within the walls of the home. It extends into the neighborhood, the extended family when they're visiting others. It goes into the workplace where the parents work, and what knowledge the parents bring home. This is a copy of Uri Bronfenbrumer's ecological model, and it just gives us a framework to be thinking about all the many things that can influence a child's environment, such as if a parent were to be stressed out at work. Well, that parent may very well be bringing that stress into the home. So trying to find out as much as you can about not just the microsystem of that child, but the many layers that influence the child's environment, or that make up the child's environment. Because we know that every home is a learning environment. that each and every student comes to school with a valuable knowledge, and we call that knowledge funds of knowledge. It's those bits of wisdom and important information that he or she has learned from family members and others in the community. I've already talked about this somewhat. I've talked about the child who brought in the haw jelly and talked about sterilization. I mentioned to you that I had a child who could tear apart a car motor and put it back together. But I'm never going to test these students on that knowledge necessarily. But those are still very valuable resources that can help me as a teacher, can help you as a teacher inform your practice and better meet the students' academic and social emotional needs. Another example was the one that I shared with you about nopales and the child's family using the cactuses or cacti for salad. So just this week, really look at what your students are bringing from home with them to school. And asking yourself, how much do you know about your student's home language and his or her literacy practices? Thinking along the lines that literacy practices are anything in which the children and the parents are sharing. Anytime the child is listening, speaking, reading, or writing, we're going to call those language and literacy practices. So one of the things I suggest is that you use the language and literacy survey and send it home with the parents. It's on Blackboard, and I've given you a copy in English. If you do have an English learner, you could send that home in Spanish. Also, interviewing the parents. If you are able to either have them come in or call them on the phone, I would strongly encourage you that you interview the parents to find out more about what they're doing at home. One thing that I really like to do as a classroom teacher was send home pretty much a blank sheet of paper except with these directions. And at the top of the page, I would say, in 1 page or less, tell me about your child. What would you really like for me to know? You might include his or her hobbies, interests, extracurricular activities, favorite foods, and future goals and ambitions. Tell me about your child's strengths and characteristics that make him or her unique. Now, this was one of my favorite things to do because when these start coming back, wow, do you learn a lot about this child or about your children. Sometimes parents would only write a little bit. Sometimes parents, even though it says write in 1 page or less, parents would fill up a couple of pages of notebook pages, and they would share quite a bit about their child. So if you haven't done this already, there's something about giving the parents a blank sheet and letting them write. It also gives you a very interesting perspective on their own skills as a writer. Not that we're judging, but it does give you some insight on that. Here I've written it in German just to show you that even though Google Translate or some of these other apps is not necessarily, they're not the best way to do this. If you do it, you're going to want to put at the bottom a disclaimer that says, Bitte entschuldigen Sie. So it says, please excuse the errors. This document was translated by Google or whatever software you used. We've already talked about Avril, but just to remind you that the reason we want children who are already reading and writing in their first language, we want to find out about their practices because we want to help support bilingual learning, and we want them to be able to use their first language to help support their English learning and vice versa. So thinking about your school and the very first faces that your families see when they come into school, it's often our office staff, and this and how they are greeted makes an incredible difference in how welcome they feel. So just be an observer, if you will, and I'm sure there have been several times you've been in the office and you've seen how parents are greeted. Thinking about, did the person in the office make eye contact? Did they smile? Even if that person was busy, did they acknowledge that the person was there when they walked in and said, un momento, one moment, please, I'll be right with you. And then I'd like for you to look around your office and see if the parents have access to a poster that indicates that they need an interpreter, because many school districts do not realize that we have some resources available and for this, and I'm going to share one with you. So just to make sure you understand, it is a federal law that parents and guardians of English learners have the right to an interpreter, and it's at no cost to them. So if you'll look at the bottom of the screen, if I move this so you can see it better, there's a website. This is an editable document. I wouldn't put all of these languages, maybe just the 4 or 5 that are most likely to happen in your neck of the woods. But basically each one of these statements says, you have the right to an interpreter at no cost to you. Please point to your language. An interpreter will be called. Please wait. And here it is in the horizontal view. Again, you can edit it and just use the languages that you would most likely need. There's the second page to that. And then I created this PowerPoint slide, and I've shared it with you in, actually, I think it might be a Word document, but I've shared it on Blackboard. And so the point of this is, if you use the poster maker, make this large. If you've got a Spanish-speaking parent who comes in and needs to ask for an interpreter, and they can read. Now the trick here is, if you have a parent who is struggling to read in their native language of Spanish, then this will still possibly be a struggle, even though the pictures may help. If they're going to point to what they need, and maybe they're going to read. If they've got a doctor's appointment or they need to speak to the nurse, I found this to be very helpful for parents to have this available, just to help communicate with the office staff. So find out, does your school district provide information in a language or in the languages that parents can understand? Because that is also a federal law that they must. Oftentimes teachers may not know how the district provides that information. So maybe this week you'll do some checking on that. You'll do some asking around. Know that phone apps, while I know that they work in a pinch, they're not the best idea. I've had a lot of success with the Say Hi app. Put that on my phone. It tends to be a little bit more, for one thing, it allows me to toggle between, say, Mexican Spanish and Guatemalan Spanish. That's been helpful for me because the dialects are very different sometimes. Another couple websites that I've liked to use is Reverso Context and SpanishDictionary.com, DICT. Those tend to translate a little better, or a lot better than Google Translate or Bing. And just know that when you're communicating with parents, you need to be mindful of using idioms or figures of speech. They absolutely do not translate well in these apps. So think about when you print out something or you want to translate something. Take out the extra information. Oftentimes we'll want to say something cute. So we might say, "Dear parents, hold on to your hats. The third grade team has quite an exciting adventure planned for Friday, May 3rd, 2019. As part of our habitat study, we will travel to the Isle of Palms near Charleston, South Carolina for an eco-barrier island tour." Well, instead of all that, make sure you send home the letter in English, and then when you translate into Spanish, keep it simple. "Dear parents, on Friday, May 3rd, 2019, our class will travel by bus to the Isle of Palms near Charleston to learn more about ocean animals." They don't need all the other information because you're going to give it to them in the English version. And if they ask for extra information, that's when you might call an interpreter. Avoid asking other children to interpret for you. For a short message every now and then, this might be fine, but interpreting and translating are really tiresome for children. And if the child is interpreting or translating for you, he or she is not on task, learning and doing what he needs to do to learn. Secondly, children should not be privy to confidential information, so they should not be helping an English learner family register another child unless that family has brought in that child. But I was in a school in which a fifth grade student was called out of class to help a family register for school. The fifth grader had never met this family before, and the secretary sat that student down, and that student asked for all kinds of work information, personal information, medical information that he should not have been privy to. For IEP meetings, it is against the law to use anyone but a certified interpreter during meetings. If that's happening, your school is in violation of federal law, and when the State Department audits you, if they find out, you will be cited. IEP meetings without a certified interpreter for English learner parents is a very big no-no. Find out what translation and interpretation services are available for you in your school district, and know that you are required by law to communicate with parents in languages that they can understand. It's not an option. You also should, for your English learners, if you have written accommodations, you should be writing on or typing in grade is ESOL accommodated or grades are ESOL accommodated on the interim, the 9 weeks, and the semester report cards in a language that parents can understand. But make sure you also write it in English because you want to be able to read what you've written. Years ago, the South Carolina Department of Education produced an English language learner handbook. They have taken that down, but not before I could copy some of the statements. You should be putting a statement, you should be putting a statement on your, you should know that ESOL students cannot be given a failing grade in a content area or be retained at grade level on the basis of their lack of English proficiency. So giving them the appropriate instructional accommodations is absolutely key. Now what that means is you're giving work to students that is on their level, that is within the guidelines that you've talked to your ESOL teacher about, and that student is able to do this work. Now, having said that, if you give the child some work that he or she can do, and that child puts his or her head down and refuses to do the work that is on his level and that he can do, that child may be able to receive an F. Just know that if you have an F on an English learner's report card, that's a red flag to the State Department to check, to interview you, to ask you about how that child got the F. As long as you can document how that child got the F, you're okay. Just make sure you're following those accommodations and modifications. So in the event that a student fails a course or subject, the classroom teacher will be required to provide the adequate documentation that the reason for the failure was due to factors other than language acquisition, such as refusal to work. Okay? Specifically, the classroom teacher must be able to show evidence of how the curriculum, how his or her instruction, and how assessments were accommodated and modified for each failing assignment. And I'm saying this after having gone through a State Department audit where they pulled teachers out of the classroom and inquired after checking in Power Schools and looking at grades. So just letting you know, many of you use Class Dojo, and if you do, then you are probably already know that it has several languages available. Just make sure that you've got it set up so that your notifications go home in the parent's preferred language. Looking at bilingualism, it's really important that when you are talking about your child this week, you are looking at him or her from an asset-based perspective. If that child is an English learner, if that child is an emerging bilingual, there are so many assets to being bilingual. Think of it as adding a language. We're not taking away their native language. We're adding English. That student is going to be able to access more cognates, base words, root words, prefixes, and suffixes. He or she is going to be able to communicate with a wider range of people, have greater appreciation and understanding for other cultures. It gives students, when students are bilingual, that it gives them a head start to language requirements in high school and college. I know personally, I enjoyed my 2 German classes in college because I had a leg up on the other students. Obviously gives more job opportunities if the student is if a job candidate is bilingual. And Stephen Krashen's done a lot of work on the effect of being bilingual and decreasing your chances of dementia and onset of Alzheimer's disease. So that's really exciting for me. He jokes that the other things that include that help with onset of Alzheimer's is caffeine consumption, 2 to 3 cups a day, and reading for pleasure. So Stephen Krashen suggests, drinking your morning coffee while reading your favorite book in a second language. That's the easy way to remember it. So you might want to check out his research and see if you agree. I want to point out this everythingESL.net as a resource for you. Judy Haynes has developed a really good culture quiz, and in it she lists over, I think, 40 examples of scenarios in which students showed either troublesome behavior or they're situations that a classroom teacher might face. And they're almost like riddles. Like, can you figure out why there's a struggle here? What is the issue here? So I encourage you to look on there and check out that resource. One of the things that was important to me as an ESOL teacher were my family engagement activities. So every 4 to 6 weeks, I planned activities for the parents and the families to join, to participate in. And I found someone in the community who spoke Spanish, who was willing to come in and translate for me because I don't speak Spanish fluently. I found out what the parents needed, what they wanted with some surveys. I sent home invitations in English and Spanish. I sent home reminders. And at the meetings that we had, I had just light refreshments, cookies, some grapes, some bottled water, and sometimes I had small incentives or door prizes. And don't worry if you can't understand all the content of the meeting when someone's translating for you. Sometimes I would say what I wanted to say, and then the translator would translate for me. But even though I couldn't understand the translator, I would follow along as best I could. So in this picture, we're doing yoga. In this picture, the parents were really concerned about the changes in immigration and these ICE raids that were happening, that were really prevalent a couple of years ago. And so I felt that we had a lot of success at my 3 schools getting the families involved in coming to school. Some other ideas that you might want to consider. We had a separate back to school night where the nurse spoke, the principal spoke, the nurse spoke, the guidance counselor spoke, how to help your child with schoolwork. We had a tea and technology about the free and almost free resources that were available online. I've already talked about the yoga. We had a health fair where we asked different agencies to come and do blood pressure, vision, and hearing screening. The Alpha Center was our local drug and alcohol abuse center. They partnered with us to have a meeting. And in fact, this fellow here was the interpreter who worked at the Alpha Center. And we just based our meetings sometimes on our community resources, such as we had someone come in and speak about the appropriate screen time for young children. And I used healthychildren.org as part of that information. So I encourage you to start a binder or a Google folder. Be thinking about ways you can involve the parents, but also be thinking about the resources that you might need if you have a family that's struggling. Do you know where the local food banks are? Do you know where the homeless shelter is located in your area, or crisis centers, any support groups, low and no cost counseling services? Are there any free English classes in your neighborhood? But start gathering those ideas now. If you haven't checked out Colorin, Colorado, it is wonderful. It's a bilingual site. It has a lot of information for teachers and families. I love to share that website with families. And Unite for Literacy is a free online reading resource that you might also want to check out if Spanish is one of the languages that you need in your classroom and that your students need at home. And just keep in mind that when schools, families, and community groups work together to support learning, children tend to do better in school, they stay in school longer, and like school more.